Hey, it's Lindsay and Brandy, and this is Real Therapy Gone Wrong, where we talk about therapy and mental health representation in movies and TV. While we are licensed therapists in real life, this show does not constitute therapy. Today, we are discussing the Menendez Brothers. We will be using the documentary The Menendez Brothers and the docudrama Monsters, both of which are on Netflix. This will be our first two-part episode because there's so much to cover, and part two will be out on November 28th. So, Brandy, take it away.
Hey, okay. So I have a content warning and a disclaimer at the top of this episode. The content warning is that we will be discussing child abuse, rape, and violence against children. And the disclaimer is that we are not diagnosing any mental health disorders. Like Lindsay and I don't know the Menendez brothers. We are not personally involved in this story at all. But our purpose in discussing this case is to show the harm perpetrated by mental health professionals' lack of ethics, to discuss mental health outcomes of prolonged child sexual abuse, and also to highlight the lack of understanding of abuse outcomes in the legal system and just society at large.
Yeah.
The sources that we used are the LA District Attorney Office. There's a National Institutes of Health Literature Review that I briefly mentioned, Town and Country Magazine, Vanity Fair, Forbes, NPR, ABC News, the Netflix documentary The Menendez Brothers, the Netflix show Monsters, and also a little bit from People Magazine. Gave ourselves a lot of homework for this episode, but it was really fun to learn about it. Is fun the right word? It was really interesting to learn about it and learn about the history of that era, which I was around for. Lindsay was not. What year were you born?
90.
90. Okay. Lindsay was born the year that they got arrested.
Yeah, so at the time I was unaware of what was
Right.
happening.
I do remember this because in 1989, when the murders happened, I was 16. So I do remember this, and this was one of the first cases that I remember being in the news and learning about. So here, I'm just going to give a little recap of the murders to start us off. So on August 20th, 1989, Eric and Lyle Menendez, who Eric was 18 and Lyle was 21 at the time, shot their parents in their Beverly Hills 90210 home. The parents were in the family room watching TV, and the brothers shot them with shotguns. Apparently, Jose's skull was blown off. All the accounts talk about how brutal it looked. One of the accounts said his brain actually fell out of his head while
Hmm.
the police were there taking pictures and things. And Kitty was on the floor, and it was really a gruesome scene by all of the accounts.
Yeah.
After they shot their parents, the brothers went to the movies to try to establish an alibi. And later that night, from the house, Lyle, the older brother, called 911 and reported that his parents had been killed. So the documentary covers the night of the shootings. And also, like Lyle says, they never tested him for gunshot residue. They really didn't have an alibi that was provable. So in the documentary, they're going back and forth from footage from the time, interviewing people, and I'll give a list of those people in a second, who are involved in the case in present day. And also, they have phone recordings of interviews with Lyle and Eric Menendez from prison.
Hmm.
So, the journalist and author Robert Rand, who wrote The Menendez Brothers, which was a book, I think it came out in 2018, he has covered the case since the day after the murders. He speaks in the documentary quite a bit. Other people in the documentary are Pamela Bozanich. I'm not sure if I said her name right. She was the prosecutor in the first trial. She really comes off like a total
Oh,
bitch in this
she
documentary.
is a huge bitch. And she was back then, and she still is today. It was hard to see what all she had to say. I know we'll get into it, but yeah, there were a few moments watching where I was like, damn,
Yeah.
she's got a strong opinion about that.
She really does. She
Yeah.
really seems, and also she is maybe because the point of a prosecutor is to defend the victims of the case. So I get she takes her job very seriously. Alan Abramson of the LA Times. Jurors from the first trial, Betty Oldfield and Hazel Thornton, from two of the jurors from the first trial. Dr. Vickery, who is a psychologist defense expert for Eric. John Conti, who is the psych expert for Lyle. Diane Vandermolen, who was a cousin who supported the brothers all along. Joan Vandermolen, who was Kitty Menendez's sister. Jose's sister and brother in law. And then Anne Burgess, who's a professor of psychiatric nursing at UPenn, who was a defense expert. Of all of these people, the only person who says they think the brothers are full of shit is the prosecutor.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else is supporting their story and believes their story.
And the prosecutor says it so definitively. She's no, their whole story was fabricated and blah, blah, blah. She says it like she knows. Nope, I know they're
Yeah,
lying. And I'm like, how would you know that?
yeah.
Yeah, very
I don't
strong
think
opinion.
very strong. Robert Rand said that he interviewed Lyle the day after the murders and that Lyle was telling the legend basically of Jose Menendez. And in this, all of the media about this, the thing that seems to stand out is that there are two stories about Jose Menendez, two storylines. One is that he's this amazing business person. He was born in Cuba to basically Cuban royalty. It's really affluent family. And then because of the revolution, he had to leave when he was 16. He came to America. He didn't have shit. He is like this self-made man. By his 40s, he was CEO of Hertz. He actually is the person at Hertz who hired OJ Simpson to do Hertz commercials,
That was
which,
news. That was news to me. I was like, wow, what an interesting fact.
yeah. And also at the time, to have a black man fronting a major company in a
Mm-hmm.
commercial was like very not mind blowing, but that did not happen. That was a
Yeah.
risk that Jose Menendez took.
Mm.
So then he goes to work for RCA. He's the head of RCA Records, where he signs the band Menudo, among other notable artists. And OJ and Menudo will come up again later in our story. So the other side of Jose Menendez, which is not told not just by the brothers, but by so many people who testified in the first trial, is that he was an abusive son of a bitch. And both brothers testified in the first trial to the abuse, and the entire first trial was videotaped and aired on court TV. So this was also a new thing. I think there was one trial before then that was aired start to finish on court TV. Like court TV
Mhm.
was new. It wasn't a thing before the late 80s, early 90s that you could watch court proceedings on television.
Yeah.
And you can go back and watch their testimony, and some of it is in the documentary, and it's just gutting. I don't know how you could watch that and think that they're lying. Like they would
I
have
don't
to be
know.
Meryl Streep level actresses to,
Yeah, they were the way that it was so hard for them to talk about the abuse seemed very genuine to me.
yeah,
That's how abuse survivors tell their story. It's really hard, and they're doing it in front of all these people on the stand. I think one of the jurors said either they're just these amazing actors or they're telling the truth. And I think they were telling the truth.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think so too. Also, they couldn't find anyone to testify anything good about Jose Menendez in the first trial except his secretary. Could not find one other person to say nice things about this man. Really indicates a pattern of him being an abusive asshole. So the murders happen. And then afterwards, the brothers go on a spending spree. On the one hand, I could see how this seems like ridiculous and brazen. And the first prosecutor, the bitchy one, calls it crazy. But on the other hand, if you've been controlled and abused your whole life, and then the people who controlled and abused you are gone, it makes sense that you would lose your shit with freedom and
Mhm.
not know how to handle that. Plus, there's all this pressure about family affairs. It makes sense to me that they would spend a lot of money. And also, they were young men who didn't have their prefrontal cortexes fully. Monsters really goes hard on this time period. really all in, like shows like partying and cocaine, and it shows Lyle especially being like this super intense, like crazy person. And it really doesn't, like nothing else that I've seen other than Monsters has really portrayed him that way. The documentary doesn't really, it does talk about their spending, but it doesn't portray him as just almost like this rabid animal.
Yeah, Monsters was really hard to watch because it felt very one note. There was no nuance to the brothers. It was just they're greedy and horrible, and especially Lyle. Like in Monsters, Eric's like crying at one point, but Eric or Lyle especially is painted in this really negative light. And in the documentary, I think someone says he might have had manipulative tendencies like his father did. But again, I think it's way more complicated than just, oh, he's manipulative. It's like he found a way to cope and survive with the abuse. And a lot of times that does involve being manipulative in a way.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, Monsters, I don't think really portrayed them in the most accurate way. It was, I think the point was to show, oh, they killed their parents and they're happy about it. Now they get to go party. And when you watch the documentary, that's not really that's not how it went down. Right.
right. Yeah. I think Ryan Murphy did a disservice to how he portrayed them for sure.
Yeah.
And in People, he said that his intent was to show multiple perspectives and let viewers interpret. And I think that's bullshit. I think his intent was to be like as salacious as he could possibly be.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about this at the end of the second episode, but right now there are actually three different paths to freedom that they could have. And so Monsters, even though it's fairly new, isn't aging well because it really portrays them as like terrible killers. And with what's coming out recently, it seems like the tide is changing. So
Hmm.
that'll be exciting to talk about.
Yeah.
So the police get suspicious about the spending and find also, they discover where the brothers had bought the guns. One of them had borrowed a friend's ID to buy guns, and the boys are arrested in March 8th, 1990. And in current interviews, Lyle said that he thinks the police staged the arrest for media purposes to make a scene.
Mhm.
And he also says that the arrest was a relief. Like they were both just carrying all of this stress about what they had done.
Yeah.
The story made national and international news, and the brothers didn't want to destroy their dad's reputation and did not at first confess or talk about the abuse. And this is another thing I remember about the time. Like it was all over late night talk shows and Saturday Night Live, and everybody was making fun of these brothers that killed their parents,
Yeah.
which is really sad knowing
Really
what we
sad.
know. Yeah. So also along comes this really interesting character person, Judalon Smith. So Judalon Smith is a patient slash lover of this Beverly Hills doctor, Dr. Oziel. It's not clear to me. I couldn't tease out if the arrest was before Judalon went to the police or after, but they happened very close together, at least, right?
Yeah.
So Eric had been seeing Dr. Oziel as a result of some burglaries that he had done. So in typical like rich kid fashion, like or rich person fashion, like you get in trouble and instead of going to jail, if you're white and rich, you could go to therapy or say you're a sex addict. We talked about that in the last episode.
Yeah.
So he was going to see Dr. Oziel because of these burglaries. Unbeknownst to him, Jose Menendez had made Dr. Oziel sign a contract saying that Dr. Oziel would tell Jose Menendez anything that Eric said to him in counseling. In Monsters, it shows them going as a family, but it doesn't talk about that in the documentary at all. And I think
No.
maybe that didn't happen. They didn't go as a
I Yeah, I don't think they went as a family. You very much get the impression it was Eric who went, and the fact that Jose Menendez had the therapist agree, whatever Eric tells me, I will tell you, is very much indicative to me that Jose Menendez is hiding something. He does
yeah,
not want Eric to disclose what he's doing to him.
yes.
That's how I take it.
So let's talk about Dr. Oziel for a moment. This is actually some stuff I got from Town and Country magazine, which is a weird source, but we'll go with it. So Oziel received his doctorate in clinical psychology from Arizona State University in 1972. After living in South Carolina, he moved to Beverly Hills and started a private practice, and he taught also at USC. According to LA Times, he became an expert in phobias of various sorts, but as he related in court, the majority of his professional articles deal with sex related disorders. So I tried to look up what some of those articles were, but they were all behind a paywall, so I didn't read any of them, but that would be really interesting. So
Mm-hmm.
in March 1990, Judalon Smith went to the police and told them about the tapes. And so Dr. Oziel, um, well, let me back up. Eric went after the murders to talk to Dr. Oziel, and he confessed to Dr. Oziel that he had done these murders. Lyle also comes. They're talking to Dr. Oziel about this. Dr. Oziel is taping them. They don't tell Dr. Oziel about the abuse. Dr. Oziel has no intention of using the tapes. He wants the boys to invest some of their money in one of his businesses. So he is recording them without their consent, which is not legal for counselors to do.
And he's
Counselors should,
blackmailing them.
and then he's blackmailing them.
And it's also
And
and it's also really weird, or something that is very weird about this is that so Eric is the client, but he requests that Lyle come in so that Lyle's also on the tape. How fucking weird is that? Have you ever in your whole career had a client sibling come in? No, that doesn't
no,
make any sense. That's a huge red flag right there too.
no, not unless you're doing family
Of
therapy. The
course,
sibling
yeah.
would have to sign intake paperwork. Like
Yes.
it would be a whole thing. It wouldn't just
Yeah.
be like, hey, bro, can you pop over here
Yeah, like my
for
client
a sec?
told me you did something with them, so come in and let's talk about. No, that makes zero sense.
Yeah, 0 cents. Okay. So the cops have the tapes, and there was a legal battle for 2 years. And finally, the Supreme Court of California ruled that two out of the four tapes would be admissible in court. So Oziel becomes a witness for the prosecution. He testified about the confessions for the prosecution and then had this cross examination that undermined his credibility, a lot of it having to do with the details of his quote affair with Judalon Smith. So the other thing that Oziel was doing was he was fucking his clients. And what I found out, there was actually just this September a Vanity Fair article about Dr. Oziel. And the article is by Julie Miller. It came out September 23rd, 2024. It says Leslie Abramson got Oziel to admit he hadn't told the Menendez family, who hired him after the boys were caught burglarizing, that his license was on probation already. Okay, so his license was already on probation before he even started seeing them. And it was because he was having dual relationship. He was exchanging therapy for construction work. So here we have another thing that he is doing that is unethical.
And also the prosecutor at one point in the documentary, because they were wanting to revoke his license, she was like, "Can't you just wait 2 more weeks so that he can
Yeah,
still have his license while he's on the stand?" And I was like, "You are a piece of shit
yeah,
for requesting that."
yes, disgusting. In 1990, Judalon Smith filed a lawsuit against Oziel, alleging that he assaulted, raped, kidnapped, and medicated her. And when Abramson asked whether Oziel settled the case, he replied that his insurance company settled. So it was like 400 or $500,000 in
Mhm.
1990 that she
Mhm.
got. So something happened, right? And the state psychology board was accusing him of engaging in a sexual relationship with another woman who worked at his house as a housekeeper, and that he improperly gave her medication and assaulted her. Oziel denied those charges. It was also revealed during trial that he didn't turn his tapes into authorities because he was hiding them, which he wouldn't have to turn the tapes into authorities anyway, because
Yeah.
if a client reports a crime, that is still under patient confidentiality.
Yeah, and I'm going to get into a few things about the confidentiality of all of this. But yeah, he wouldn't,
Yeah,
first of all, he should not have been recording without their consent,
right.
first of all. But even if they knew he was recording, yeah, he wouldn't have had to turn that in.
Yeah, exactly. LA Times reported he had a 6,000 square foot canyon home, a psychologist's wife, two children, and a waiting list. And at the time, his rate was $150 an hour. And I looked it up. That's $361 in today's money.
Sounds about right.
So he had state disciplinary hearings in 1997. The Consumer Affairs Board of Psychology charged him with a variety of offenses. And rather than go to court, he surrendered his license, but also denied that he engaged in improprieties. What's Dr. Oziel doing now? Let's talk about it.
Well, last thing I will say about Judalon Smith is he asked her to like eavesdrop in on the
Yes.
conversation. I guess Eric can, and again, the timeline is fuzzy, but how I read into it is like Eric confesses, he starts taping it. He knows Lyle's going to come in and he tells Judalyn Smith, wait in the waiting room. And then when they're in my office, like come and eavesdrop. So she like heard them confessing essentially, which again is like a whole clusterfuck of ethical and confidentiality violations. Like
Yes.
you have a client that you're sleeping with, but you're also using them as like a secret witness to this crime that your other client is saying that they did. Very weird. So she testifies to that as well, that he had asked her to do that for him.
Yes. We're racking up a list against him.
Totally.
He says he phased out his practice because he had a major business offer that was highly lucrative to be CEO of a large business in another state. And he now goes by Jerry Oziel, lives in Albuquerque. He's listed as a staff member at Marital Meditation Center and says that many couples are happier staying together if they can resolve certain issues and they use meditation for that. Lindsay, talk to us about confidentiality.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, there's so many violations here regarding confidentiality. So the first big one we've already touched on is as a therapist, you and I are master's level clinicians. He was a psychologist, so he's under a different board, I guess, than we would be, but it's not really that different, right? Like the rules that we follow are similar to what a psychologist would follow. But the main one is that if a client tells you about a crime they've already committed, that is still confidential. So, from like a legal standpoint, if I have a client that says I killed my dad, sure, I can go to the police and legally they'll look into it and who knows what will happen. They could get arrested, whatever. But ethically, that puts me at risk of losing my license because that is still confidential information. That's things that you still need to keep between you and the client. Now, if a client discloses they're going to commit a crime in the future, they tell you, hey, I have a gun. I'm on my way to my parents' house. I plan on shooting them. There, it gets really tricky here because it depends on the state. There is something called a duty to warn or a duty to protect, but some states are like they have a permissive, it's called like permissive duty to warn. So, like here in Texas, we have what's called a permissive duty to warn, meaning I can take the measures to warn the potential victim either by contacting them directly or contacting the police. Hey, I'm breaking confidentiality, but I want to report that someone is now like at risk of harm. But it's permissive in the fact that I don't have to do that. If I don't warn, I'm also not going to get in trouble for not warning either. And in California law, I want to say at the time, not that this really matters to this case, because again, Eric and Lyle are not saying they're going to commit a future crime. They're admitting to one they've already done. But if they were talking about a future crime, at the time, California had what was called duty to warn. And I think he would have been expected to warn authorities or the potential victim. Now, California has what's called duty to protect, which means you still want to warn of a potential threat, but you can still keep confidentiality. Meaning, hey, I learned information that this person might be at risk, and that's where you leave it.
Hmm.
You still keep confidentiality in terms like you're not going to disclose, hey, these are my exact clients. Here's exactly what they told me. You're just going to say, hey, I heard some information. They might be in danger, right? That's the big one that I think I want people to know is that if a crime's already happened, then we're going to keep that confidential. But it also depends on the nature of the crime. Like whenever it comes to minors or like elder abuse, things like that, like groups of people that are vulnerable that can't
Hmm.
protect themselves. If I had someone come and say, my partner abused our child who's 10 years old, that I do have a duty to report. Like we're mandated reporters whenever it comes to that kind of thing. So that would be an area where again, we wouldn't necessarily call the police, but we would file a report with Department of Family Services or Child Protective Services, whichever. And then there's a couple of other confidentiality. There's always certain situations where confidentiality can be broken. And another one would be if someone was had a plan of suicide. Someone came in
Yeah.
and said, here's my plan, here's what I'm going to do it. We would then call to get them help. It wouldn't be like them getting in trouble, but it would be, hey, you have a clear intent, you have a clear plan, risk of suicide is really high. Let's get you some help, some more intensive help. And then at that time, when you're making these calls, you're making these reports, confidentiality is just broken in the way of whoever gets involved knows that they're your client.
Yes.
There's a few exceptions to confidentiality. Those are like the major points that come to mind when I think of all the things that Dr. Oziel did incorrectly. And also, this one isn't really about confidentiality, but just don't have sex with your clients.
Yeah. Number one rule of counseling. Don't fuck your
Don't have sex,
client.
don't fuck your clients. It's not even a dilemma. It's just, it's very black and white. Don't do it. Were there any other, like, talking about confidentiality? Is there something I'm missing? Because there might be.
Well, I think there was a one about a bartering situation, and that also, I think that is board specific.
Mm,
Like, but I know for Texas and Colorado LPCs, you can't barter. So you can't be like, hey girl, will you cut my hair and I'll give you free therapy?
yeah.
That is a no, because that's creating a dual relationship. And we never want to have more than one type of relationship with our clients. So my client can't be my hairdresser, or my friend can't be my client, or, and this happens a lot. People will reach out to me that I know pretty well and say, hey, can you see my kid or my mom? Or, and I have to say no, because that puts me in this precarious, weird towards a dual relationship
Mm-hmm.
situation
Mm-hmm.
that I don't need to be in.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing was just the recording. A therapist should never, ever record you without your consent. And the only reason that a therapist would record that I can think of is, like when we were in school and we were doing practicum and we were baby counselors, we recorded our sessions, which our clients knew, because then we watched them with our supervisors and our peers in some cases, so that we can get input on, hey, here's what you did that was great, and here's what you could have done. It's never about, oh my God, can you believe what this client said? There's no client bashing. It's really not about the clients at all. It's really about our work as counselors.
Yeah. It's about our
And
clinical skills.
yeah, and that's really, unless maybe the counselors who do forensic interviews, which I don't do and I don't know that much about that, I would imagine those could be taped.
Yeah.
But really, a counselor should never be taping you without your consent.
Yeah,
So,
you always have them sign something.
yeah.
I've had grad interns work at my practice before, and you always have their because I in the consent form it'll say there's always an option of, hey, we like to record these sessions for educational purposes, blah 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 blah, and it tells them who all is going to see the recording, what university is going to have it. And then usually we put something in there saying that we're going to delete it eventually. Like we don't keep the recordings, right? We keep it like we have it and then we go over it and then we don't need to keep record of that. Something else I will say about confidentiality that just came to my mind when it comes to what are we mandated to report. I know I mentioned if there's like abuse of a minor, we are mandated to report, and we will get in trouble if we don't report it. We could lose our
Yes.
license if we don't report it. That would be looked into. But if an adult is telling us, if Eric was telling his therapist, hey, my dad abused me when I was younger, and he was like 18 at the time. So at this point, he's an adult. So if he was saying, like, hey, when I was a minor, my dad was abusing me, that we wouldn't have to report because the client's no longer a minor.
But if Lyle had other kids in the home, we would have to report.
Yes.
Or if Jose had other kids in the home, or we knew had access to other kids. So, like, I have made reports about adults disclosing things if I thought there was even a remote possibility that perpetrator would be around other kids. And
Yes.
the thing that I always remind myself of is I don't have to be sure and I don't have to investigate. All
Yeah.
I'm doing is calling CPS and telling them, here's this information I know, and it is their job to figure out what to do with that.
Yeah, like you're absolutely right. If it was like my dad abused me when I was young, but he spends all this time with my kids now, that would be a situation where we would report because we're reporting not just abuse we know about, but even suspected abuse. We're reporting
Yes.
that as well. But I guess I'm thinking of if, and I'm sure we've all had clients like that where they have no more communication with their abuser. Like they don't know what they're up to. They're not like there's really nothing. It's like, hey, 20 years ago when I was a certain age, I was abused. That we wouldn't have to report so much. But to your point, you're absolutely right. If there's a suspected continued abuse of other minors, then
Yeah.
yes, we would. So that's
Yeah.
just another, I guess what I'm saying is it's complicated. It can be complicated and it's best to report. If you're unsure, you might as well report, is how I
Yes.
feel about it.
And I reported where they've investigated, and I reported where they have not investigated.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's just my job to say, here's information I learned. I feel sad about the people that have that job because people are just calling them all day long, reporting horrible things that happen to children. But I do think, at least in Texas, they seem to do a good job of looking into things. Most
Mm-hmm.
of the things that I really thought I've worried about, they have opened a case on at least.
Okay,
So.
good. Yeah.
So, in addition to confidentiality, a central issue with these murders and court cases is the effects of childhood sexual abuse. So, these killings were in 1989. And in 1989, the definition of rape that was used by most states and the FBI was written such that only a person with a vagina could be raped. So, the definition of rape involved vaginal penetration.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't acknowledge battered person syndrome or the effects of childhood sexual abuse, the behaviors of the brothers. So, one thing, and Monsters really exaggerated this, I feel like, but rage, although again, it's not clear how rageful they really were, spending, crying, they had this belief that their parents were going to kill them. All makes sense in the light of what we know about the effects of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to dip a toe into literature and we can put this link in the show notes. But there was one literature review that I saw from National Institutes of Health, and it talked about brain changes from childhood sexual abuse and how it can lead to lifelong mental disorders. And there was a national comorbidity study, and it indicated a relationship between childhood sexual abuse and onset of psychiatric disorder, found that 78% of women and 82% of men who reported childhood sexual abuse met diagnostic criteria for at least one lifetime psychiatric disorder. And the people who did not report sex abuse had about 50%. So it's about 25 to 30% more
Mm-hmm.
likelihood of a lifelong psychiatric disorder. And at the time, we just really didn't have that information or have any kind of understanding about that. So that's the environment we're going into this first trial, 1993. In that trial, evidence and testimony about the brothers' abuse was allowed in. Eric's defense attorney, Leslie Abramson, opened her opening remarks said that the murders were done out of fear. There was never an argument about whether the brothers shot their parents. Everybody knew the
Yeah.
brothers said, yes, we shot them. But she said that they were done out of fear, that Jose was sadistic, and that Kitty had been leaving suicide notes and threatening to poison the family. We haven't talked a lot about Kitty yet, but it does seem like she was, if not complicit in the abuse, she knew about the abuse and didn't do anything. Like it talks about
Hmm.
that in the documentary. It talks about it a lot in Monsters, but
Yeah.
I'm honing in on the documentary because that's what we know. That's the most truthful thing we have.
Yeah.
Leslie Abramson said the origin of the killings was a lifetime of abuse. So going back to this idea that this childhood sexual abuse really created this situation where this was the only thing that the boys thought that they could do. Multiple mental health professionals testified about the abuse. Lyle, his testimony in that first trial is just gutting. And almost harder than hearing him is watching Eric during Lyle testifying and just how upset. Like at one point, it almost looks like he's sucking his thumb. Like he is, and not in a way that, like he's not acting. He's like an 18-year-old. Like no
It
18-year-old could
it seems like a genuine
put that on.
reaction. Yeah,
Yes.
it seems like a genuine reaction. And there is also the part that was, I think, really hard to listen to was Lyle saying that he molested Eric too when
Yeah.
they were a lot younger. And that was just devastating because you could tell he even apologizes for it, feels awful about it, but he's also a victim of abuse while he's doing this to his brother. And
Yeah.
it's just, it's so fucked up.
So fucked up. Lyle testified that he was sexually abused by Jose from about ages 6 to 8.
Mhm.
And then Eric testified that he was abused from as long as he could remember until his dad was dead, basically. Eric had what kind of led up to the actual murders is that Eric had dreams of going to Stanford and getting away from his dad. So this poor kid has been abused his whole life. He's it's okay. I'm going to do good in school. I'm going to go to Stanford. I'm going to get the fuck out of here and then this will all stop.
Mhm.
But his dad shortly before the murders told Eric that he wasn't allowed to go to Stanford and that he would be living at home and going to, I think UCLA was the plan.
Mhm.
And that is what prompted Eric to tell Lyle that the abuse had been going on this whole time. Lyle had no idea that Eric was enduring this abuse by his dad for all of this time. And then so they confront Jose. Also, around this time, they find out that Kitty has known about this abuse all along and hasn't done anything. Monsters really points her out to be a terrible person, and nothing that I've really seen indicates that she's as was as horrible as that show depicted her to be. But certainly, if she knew about the abuse and did nothing, that really sucks. So the brothers say they really feared that their parents were going to kill them. And that is why they killed their parents, because they say they really feared for their lives.
Yeah.
The judge in that first trial, Stanley Weisberg, who's actually the same judge in the second trial, he cautioned that abuse is not a motive for murder. And that's really the rub in this case. So the in the first trial there were two separate juries, Lyle and Eric. So the trials happened at the same time, but they had different juries.
Mhm.
And so they deliberated for a month whether it's first degree murder, second degree murder, or manslaughter. And the manslaughter, they were hoping for manslaughter because there's this thing called imperfect defense, which is where someone can believe, like really truly believe that someone is going to kill them and they kill the other person. Like in this case, this is what the boys
Yeah.
say. They really thought their parents were going to kill them, even though from the outside, it was obvious that their parents weren't going to kill them. So that's an imperfect defense because they really did think that they were in danger. So
Mhm.
after a month of deliberating, both ended up in a mistrial. And the juries apparently were split along gender lines. The women did not think it was murder and really did think the boys were abused. And the men did because the men thought that the boys couldn't be abused.
That was
So,
so hard to hear. There was that one juror, I cannot remember her name, but they interviewed her in the documentary. She said it really well. She was like, the women really understood the abuse much more than the men did. And isn't that just such an emotional weight for women to carry? Of like,
yes.
they're the only ones that could be. And at the time, and you'll hear people use this term now, it was called battered women syndrome, which is really unfair because we know very well, men and boys can be abused just as much as women and girls can. But
Yeah.
that's not what the belief was at the time. So they had that really working against them.
Yeah. That was
Hmm.
really sad. So after this mistrial, the DA comes and he says he will retry them and that death penalty is still on the table. So that's going to end our part one of the Menendez Brothers
Hmm.
episodes. And please stay tuned for the second part, which will come out on November 28th. And Lindsay has some news for you.
Yes. First of all, if you enjoyed this episode of Real Therapy Gone Wrong, please review, subscribe, and follow us where you listen to your podcast. And for our next episode is going to be part two, but then after part two, we'll be covering the movie Bad Moms Christmas, which you can view on Netflix or Amazon. And speaking of moms, this is my big announcement for our listeners. I am pregnant and due in December,
Woohoo!
about 33 weeks right now. So we'll be on a hiatus from recording until April, whenever I'm back in the swing of things. But in the meantime, we would love to know what shows you want us to cover. So please message us on Instagram, let us know. Please also rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. It really does help us to know what you guys think. If there's any feedback, we want to hear it, right? Because we want to keep making really good content for you. So if you Real Therapy Gone, we are two licensed therapists. So contact us if you'd like to learn more about our work or want to hire us. You can find me, Lindsay, at relationshipmatterstx.com or Brandy at sellerscounseling.com. If you're making a movie or TV show and do not want to find us discussing your show on our podcast, we are available to consult on your projects. So get in touch.